Margaret spent the next week carefully planning her transformation. She met with her financial advisor, instructing him to move her assets into a trust that she couldn't access for 6 months. She told Janet she was taking an extended vacation and wouldn't need her services temporarily. To her lawyer, she explained she was conducting a personal experiment and asked him to hold her identification and credit cards in his safe. The hardest part was choosing what to keep. Margaret packed a small backpack with basic clothes, a few $100s in cash, and a single photograph of her parents. Everything else, the jewelry, designer handbags, expensive shoes, went into storage. She looked around her penthouse one last time, wondering if she was making the biggest mistake of her life. Margaret had researched homeless shelters and support services extensively. She learned about the daily struggles people faced when living on the streets, finding safe places to sleep, accessing bathrooms, staying clean, and getting enough food. The reality was far harsher than she had imagined from her privileged position. On a cold Tuesday morning, Margaret left her penthouse wearing worn jeans, an old jacket, and sneakers that had seen better days. She had dyed her distinctive blonde, hair brown, and avoided makeup. Looking in the mirror, she saw a completely different person, one who could blend into crowds without turning heads or attracting attention. Her first day on the streets was a shocking education. Within hours, Margaret realized how invisible homeless people were to most of society. She sat on park benches and watched thousands of people walk by without making eye contact. The few who acknowledged her presence did so with expressions ranging from discomfort to disgust. Margaret found herself at a community center that served free meals. The dining hall was filled with people from all walks of life, families who had lost their homes, elderly individuals on fixed incomes, young people who had aged out of foster care, and veterans struggling with invisible wounds. She had expected to feel out of place, but instead found herself welcomed into conversations about everything from politics to poetry. "First time here?" asked a man named Tom, who sat across from her at the long table. His clothes were clean, but patched, and his eyes were kind, despite the weariness that seemed to cling to him like shadow. Margaret nodded, surprised by how nervous she felt. "Yes, I'm still figuring things out." Tom introduced her to others at the table. Maria, a single mother working 2 minimum-wage jobs but still unable to afford rent. Robert, a college graduate whose medical bills had bankrupted him. And Linda, an artist who created beautiful paintings despite having no permanent home. As days turned into weeks, Margaret discovered a community she had never known existed. People shared resources, looked out for each other's safety, and offered emotional support during difficult times. She learned practical skills like finding public restrooms, keeping belongings secure, and staying warm during cold nights. The physical challenges were overwhelming. Margaret's feet developed blisters from walking everywhere. Her back ached from sleeping on uncomfortable surfaces. She lost weight quickly and learned to appreciate every meal, no matter how simple. The constant uncertainty about where she would sleep each night created an anxiety she had never experienced. But alongside the hardships, Margaret discovered moments of unexpected beauty. She watched sunrise from a park bench and found it more magnificent than any expensive artwork in her penthouse. She listened to street musicians and felt their passion more deeply than she had at any concert hall. She had conversations with people whose stories taught her about resilience, hope, and the strength of the human spirit. At the community center, Margaret volunteered to help with meal preparation and cleanup. She found genuine satisfaction in work that directly helped others, something she had never experienced in her previous life of charity galas and board meetings. The staff and volunteers treated her as an equal, valuing her contributions rather than her bank account. One evening, while helping clean tables after dinner, Margaret overheard 2 volunteers talking about her. "She's got good instincts with people," one said. "Seems educated, but she doesn't talk down to anyone. Wonder what brought her here." Margaret realized that for the first time in years, people were getting to know her personality, her values, and her character, rather than making assumptions based on her wealth. It was both terrifying and liberating to be judged solely on her actions and words. The most difficult moment came when Margaret witnessed a fight between two men over a sleeping spot. She watched a security guard roughly remove them both and realized how quickly someone's situation could become dangerous through no fault of their own. That night, she lay on a cot at the shelter and wondered if she truly understood what she had gotten herself into. Margaret called her lawyer from a payphone to check that her plan was working correctly. He assured her that her assets remained secure and that no one had asked questions about her absence from social events. Her former friends apparently assumed she was traveling, and her business interests continued running smoothly without her direct involvement. As her second month on the streets began, Margaret noticed changes in herself beyond her appearance. She had developed a heightened awareness of her surroundings and a deep appreciation for small kindnesses. When a shop owner let her use the bathroom without buying anything, or when someone shared their lunch with her, these gestures felt more valuable than expensive gifts she used to receive. Margaret also began to recognize the complex reasons why people became homeless. It wasn't always addiction or laziness, as she had unconsciously assumed. Many were working people whose wages couldn't keep up with rising costs, individuals who had faced medical emergencies, or people who had simply experienced a series of unfortunate events that could happen to anyone. The experience was changing her in ways she hadn't expected. Margaret found herself more patient, more observant, and more grateful for basic necessities she had always taken for granted. She was learning to find joy in simple pleasures, and to appreciate the genuine connections she was forming with people who knew nothing about her hidden fortune. Most importantly, Margaret was beginning to understand what Sarah had meant about seeing what was really inside a person. Without the distraction of wealth and status symbols, she was discovering who she truly was underneath all the designer clothes and expensive accessories. The journey was harder than she had imagined, but also more transformative. Margaret Williams sat in her luxurious penthouse apartment, staring at the city lights below through floor-to-ceiling windows. At 32, she had everything money could buy: designer clothes filling walk-in closets, expensive artwork adorning marble walls, and a bank account that most people could only dream of. Her late father's technology company had left her with a fortune worth millions, but as she looked at her reflection in the window, Margaret felt emptier than ever. The morning sun streamed through the silk curtains as Margaret's personal assistant, Janet, knocked on the bedroom door. "Miss Williams, your breakfast is ready, and don't forget about the charity gala tonight. The car will arrive at 7. Margaret nodded absently. Another charity event where wealthy people would write checks to ease their guilt while sipping champagne, worth more than some families made in a month. She had attended dozens of these events, always surrounded by people who laughed at her jokes, a little too loudly, and agreed with everything she said. The attention felt hollow, like an echo in an empty room. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from friends asking for favors, business partners proposing deals, and suitors whose eyes lit up not when they looked at her, but when they looked at her jewelry. Margaret had learned to read the signs, the way conversations always steered toward her wealth, how people's voices changed when they discovered her last name, and the disappointed expressions when she suggested simple activities like walking in the park instead of expensive dinners. The charity gala that evening was like all the others. Margaret wore a stunning emerald dress that cost more than a car, and diamonds that sparkled under the ballroom lights. Men approached her throughout the night, each one more charming than the last, but their compliments felt rehearsed. When she mentioned she was thinking of taking a break from social events, one suitor actually asked if she was having financial troubles. The question stung more than she expected. During the auction portion of the evening, Margaret watched as people bid enormous amounts on artwork and vacation packages, not because they loved the items, but because they wanted to be seen as generous. She realized she was guilty of the same thing. Her own $50,000 bid for a painting she didn't even like was met with applause and admiring glances. That night, Margaret lay in her king-sized bed surrounded by luxury but feeling lonelier than she had ever felt in her life. She thought about her parents who had died in a car accident 3 years earlier. Before her father's company became successful, they had been a normal middle-class family. She remembered the genuine laughter around their small kitchen table, the way her mother would hum while cooking simple meals, and how her father would spend hours teaching her to ride a bicycle in their modest backyard. The next morning brought an unexpected encounter that would change everything. While walking through the financial district to her lawyer's office, Margaret noticed a homeless woman sitting outside a coffee shop. Most people walked past without a glance, but something about the woman's dignity, despite her circumstances, caught Margaret's attention. The woman wasn't asking for money or holding a sign. She simply sat quietly, watching the world go by with intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. Margaret bought 2 cups of coffee and approached the woman. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked gently. The woman looked up, surprised by the kindness in Margaret's voice rather than pity or judgment. "Thank you," the woman said with a warm smile. "I'm Sarah." They sat together on the stone steps, and Margaret found herself in the most genuine conversation she had experienced in years. Sarah had been a teacher before circumstances led her to the streets. She spoke about the people she met, the small kindnesses that meant everything, and how she had learned to find joy in simple moments like watching sunrise paint the city buildings. Gold. People see the outside, Sarah said thoughtfully, but they rarely take time to see what's really inside a person. Out here you learn quickly who has a genuine heart and who's just going through the motions of being human. Margaret felt as though Sarah was speaking directly to her soul. Here was someone who had lost everything material, yet seemed more at peace than Margaret had ever been with all her wealth. As she walked away that day, Sarah's words echoed in her mind, and a seed of an idea began to grow. That evening, Margaret stood in her closet filled with designer clothes and expensive accessories. She pulled out her simplest jeans and a plain sweater, clothes she had bought years ago and barely worn. Looking in the mirror, she barely recognized herself without the designer labels and flashy jewelry that had become her armor. The idea that had been forming all day suddenly crystallized into a plan so bold it took her breath away. What if she could experience life the way Sarah did? What if she could discover who would care about Margaret the person, not Margaret the heiress? What if she could find love that wasn't motivated by her bank account? Margaret walked to her desk and pulled out a notebook. She began making a list of everything she would need to do to temporarily leave her wealthy life behind. The plan was risky and would require careful preparation, but for the first time in years, she felt excited about the future. She thought about the men who had pursued her, wondering if any of them would give a second glance to a woman in simple clothes with no money to spend on expensive dinners. She thought about her social circle, realizing that most of her friendships were built on convenience and mutual benefit rather than genuine affection. As Margaret finalized her plan, she felt nervous but determined. She would hide her fortune, leave her luxurious life behind, and discover what it meant to connect with people who knew nothing about her wealth. She would learn what Sarah already knew, that the most valuable things in life couldn't be bought with money. The next morning, Margaret Williams would begin the most important journey of her life, one that would lead her away from everything she had known and toward a love more real than anything she had ever imagined possible. Margaret's third month living on the streets brought an unexpected encounter that would change everything. She was sitting outside a public library, reading a book she had borrowed, when someone sat down beside her on the concrete steps. "Good. Book?" asked a warm voice. Margaret looked up to see a man about her age with gentle brown eyes and a kind smile. He was dressed simply in jeans and a flannel shirt, with paint stains on his hands that suggested he worked with his hands for a living. "It's wonderful," Margaret replied, showing him the cover of a novel about finding hope in difficult circumstances. "I'm Margaret." "David," he said, extending his hand for a friendly handshake. "I work at the bookstore across the street. I've noticed you here a few times and thought I'd say hello." David explained that he had been working at the independent bookstore for 2 years while pursuing his passion as an artist. He painted in his spare time and dreamed of having his own gallery someday, but for now was content with his quiet job surrounded by books and the occasional customer who loved literature as much as he did. Margaret found herself drawn into easy conversation with David. He didn't ask personal questions about how she ended up on the streets, instead talking about books, art, and his observations about the people who passed by the library each day. His genuine interest in her thoughts and opinions felt refreshing after months of being largely invisible to most of society. "There's something different about you," David said thoughtfully. "You have this way of really listening when people talk, like you're actually interested in what they have to say. That's rare." Over the following weeks, David began joining Margaret on the library steps during his lunch breaks. He brought sandwiches to share, claiming his roommate always packed too much food. Margaret suspected he was being kind, but she appreciated both the gesture and his tactful way of helping without making her feel like a charity case. Their conversations ranged from literature to philosophy to their dreams for the future. David talked about his art with passionate enthusiasm, describing how he wanted to create paintings that would make people feel less alone in the world. Margaret found herself sharing thoughts and ideas she had never expressed to anyone, feeling safe in David's non-judgmental presence. "What's your story?" David asked one afternoon as they watched children play in the nearby park. "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to, but you seem like someone who's been through something significant." Margaret had prepared for this question, knowing she would need to create a believable background story. She told David that she had been working in an office job that felt meaningless, living a life that didn't feel authentic, and had decided to step away from everything to figure out who she really was, underneath all the expectations others had placed on her. The story was closer to the truth than she had expected it to be. David nodded with understanding, sharing that he had made a similar choice when he left a promising career in advertising to pursue art and work in the bookstore. "Sometimes you have to lose everything you thought you wanted to discover what you actually need," David said wisely. "It takes courage to walk away from a life that looks good on paper, but doesn't feed your soul." Margaret felt a flutter in her chest at his words. Here was someone who understood the importance of authentic living, who valued substance over surface appearances. She found herself looking forward to their daily meetings with an anticipation she hadn't felt since she was a teenager. David began inviting Margaret to free community events, outdoor concerts in the park, art exhibitions at local galleries, poetry readings at coffee shops. He never offered to pay for anything expensive, instead sharing activities that cost nothing but offered rich experiences. Margaret discovered that these simple outings brought her more joy than any expensive entertainment she had enjoyed in her previous life. One evening, David invited Margaret to see his paintings in the small studio apartment he shared with a roommate. The space was tiny and cluttered, but the walls were covered with beautiful artwork that took Margaret's breath away. His paintings captured moments of human connection, strangers helping each other, children playing, elderly couples holding hands. "These are incredible," Margaret said genuinely, studying a painting of a homeless man reading to a child in a park. "You have such a gift for seeing the beauty in everyday moments." David blushed at the compliment. "I paint what I see around me. There's so much beauty in the world if you just pay attention. Like meeting you. That was an unexpected gift that made my whole world brighter." Margaret felt her heart skip a beat. She was falling in love with David, but the feeling was complicated by the enormous secret she was keeping. How could she be authentic with someone while living such a fundamental lie? That night, lying on her cot at the shelter, Margaret wrestled with her conscience. David represented everything she had been searching for: kindness, authenticity, creativity, and a heart that valued substance over superficiality. But their relationship was built on deception, even if her feelings were completely genuine. Margaret began to notice how David interacted with other people experiencing homelessness. He treated everyone with the same respect and dignity, never talking down to anyone or making assumptions based on their circumstances. When he saw someone struggling, he helped quietly and without fanfare. His character shone through in 100 small actions. She also observed how David managed his own limited finances. He was clearly not wealthy, but he was generous with what he had. He bought coffee for elderly customers at the bookstore who seemed lonely, contributed to tip jars for street musicians, and always had $1 or $2 for someone who asked for help. Margaret realized that David's values aligned perfectly with what she had been searching for, but she worried constantly about how he would react if he discovered her deception. Would he feel betrayed by her lies? Would he assume she had been conducting some kind of social experiment at his expense? Would he question whether any of her feelings had been genuine? The internal conflict grew stronger as her feelings for David deepened. Every kind gesture he made, every thoughtful conversation they shared, every moment of connection they experienced felt both wonderful and weighted with guilt. Margaret was living the most authentic relationship of her life while maintaining the biggest lie she had ever told. David seemed to sense something was troubling her, though he interpreted her occasional sadness differently than its true cause. "You seem worried about something lately," he said one afternoon. "If you ever want to talk about what brought you to this point in your life, I'm here to listen without judgment." Margaret looked into his caring eyes and felt her heart break a little. She was falling deeply in love with a man who thought he knew her, while she was keeping the most fundamental truth about herself hidden. The weight of the secret was becoming almost unbearable, but she wasn't ready to risk losing the most meaningful relationship she had ever experienced. As autumn arrived, Margaret's relationship with David grew deeper and more meaningful. They had been meeting regularly for 2 months, and she found herself completely captivated by his gentle nature, his artistic passion, and his genuine care for others. Every day brought new discoveries about his character that made her fall more deeply in love. David had begun saving small amounts from his modest bookstore salary to take Margaret on what he called adventures. These weren't expensive outings, but rather creative dates that showed his thoughtfulness. He packed picnic lunches for walks along the riverbank, found free outdoor movies in the park, and discovered art installations in unexpected places throughout the city. "I know I can't offer you fancy dinners or expensive entertainment," David said one evening as they watched the sunset from a hill overlooking the city, "but I hope you know that what I feel for you isn't limited by what's in my wallet." Margaret's heart ached with love and guilt simultaneously. David was apologizing for not having money to spend on her, while she had millions sitting in accounts she couldn't access. The irony was almost unbearable, but she also realized that his simple, heartfelt gestures meant more to her than any expensive gift she had ever received. One particularly meaningful evening, David took Margaret to a community center where he volunteered teaching art classes to children from low-income families. She watched him patiently help a shy 8-year-old mix colors for her painting, his face lighting up when the little girl smiled with pride at her creation. "Art saved my life," David explained as they walked home afterward. "When I was a kid, we didn't have much money and I felt like I didn't belong anywhere. But when I discovered painting, I found a way to express feelings I couldn't put into words. If I can give that gift to even one child, it makes everything worthwhile." Margaret listened to David's stories about growing up in a working-class family, how his parents had worked multiple jobs to support their children, and how he had learned the value of hard work and perseverance. His background couldn't have been more different from her privileged upbringing, yet she felt more connected to him than to anyone from her previous social circle. David's friends gradually accepted Margaret into their group. They were a diverse collection of artists, bookstore employees, community volunteers, and people who valued creativity and authenticity over material success. Margaret discovered the joy of genuine friendships built on shared interests and mutual respect, rather than social status or financial advantage. During a group dinner at someone's small apartment, Margaret watched David interact with his friends and marveled at the easy affection and loyalty they shared. When one friend lost his job, the others immediately rallied to help him find new opportunities and offered emotional support. When another friend's art was featured in a local gallery, they all celebrated as if it were their own success. This is what real community looks like, Margaret thought to herself, remembering the competitive and transactional nature of relationships in her previous life. Margaret's feelings for David continued to intensify, but so did her internal conflict about the deception. She began having trouble sleeping, wrestling with the knowledge that their relationship, while emotionally genuine, was built on a fundamental lie about who she was. The situation became more complicated when David began opening up about his struggles with money. His artistic dreams often conflicted with financial reality, and Margaret could see the stress it caused him. He worked extra shifts at the bookstore to save money for art supplies, sometimes skipping meals to afford canvas and paint. Sometimes, "I wonder if I'm being selfish," David confided one evening. "Maybe I should get a better-paying job, something more practical. But when I paint, I feel like I'm doing what I was meant to do with my life." Margaret wanted desperately to help him, to secretly provide the financial support that would allow him to focus on his art. But she knew that any such gesture would raise questions she couldn't answer without revealing her true identity. Placer. Closest call came when David became ill with flu and couldn't work for a week. Margaret watched him worry about paying rent and buying groceries, growing pale with stress on top of his physical illness. She knew she could solve all his problems with a single phone call to her lawyer, but instead had to watch someone she loved struggle with difficulties she could easily resolve. "I hate feeling helpless," Margaret wrote in a journal she had started keeping. "I love David more than I've ever loved anyone, but I can't be truly honest with him, and I can't help him in the ways that would make the biggest difference in his life." David's resilience during this difficult time only made Margaret love him more. Despite his own struggles, he continued to volunteer at the community center and help friends who were facing their own challenges. His character shone brightest when circumstances were most difficult. Margaret also began to understand something important about David's relationship with money. While he struggled financially, he wasn't motivated by wealth or material possessions. His happiness came from his art, his relationships, and his ability to contribute positively to other people's lives. She realized that even if she revealed her fortune, David might not be interested in the lifestyle her money could provide. This realization both comforted and worried her. It suggested that David's feelings for her were genuine and not motivated by financial gain, but it also made her question whether her wealth might actually be an obstacle to their relationship rather than an asset. One evening, as they sat on their usual library steps, David took Margaret's hand and looked into her eyes with an intensity that made her heart race. "I need to tell you something," he said softly. "I've fallen in love with you, Margaret. I know we haven't known each other very long, and I know our circumstances aren't ideal, but what I feel for you is real and deeper than anything I've ever experienced." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. The words she had been longing to hear filled her with joy and terror simultaneously. She loved David desperately, but how could she respond honestly when so much of their relationship was based on her? "Deception? I love you too," she whispered, knowing that this at least was completely true. David smiled with relief and happiness, pulling her into a gentle embrace. As Margaret held him close, she felt the full weight of her predicament. She had found the love she had been searching for, but it existed within a web of lies that threatened to destroy everything if the truth ever came to light. That night, Margaret lay awake, planning how she might gradually reveal the truth about herself. Her 6-month commitment was nearly complete, but the thought of returning to her previous life while potentially losing David seemed impossible to bear. She had to find a way to bridge these two worlds, but she had no idea how to do it without risking the most precious thing she had ever found. The crisis that would test everything came suddenly and without warning. Margaret was spending a quiet afternoon with David in his studio apartment when his roommate burst through the door with devastating news. "David, you need to call your mom." "Right away," James said breathlessly. "It's about your dad." David's face went pale as he dialed his family's number. Margaret watched his expression crumble as he listened to his mother's voice on the other end of the line. When he hung up, his hands were shaking. "Dad had a heart attack," David said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's in intensive care. Mom says it's serious and the doctors aren't sure if he's going to make it." Margaret's heart broke watching the man she loved struggle with this terrible news. David's father was a factory worker who had supported his family for 30 years, and David adored him despite their occasional disagreements about David's artistic career choices. "I have to get home," David said, running his hands through his hair anxiously. "But I don't have money for a plane ticket, and it's a 12-hour drive. By the time I could get there by bus—" He didn't finish the sentence, but Margaret understood. Time was critical, and David's limited resources were trapping him when his father needed him most. She watched helplessly as David frantically called friends, trying to borrow money for emergency travel. Margaret knew she could solve this problem instantly. A single phone call to her lawyer would provide immediate access to funds that could get David to his father's bedside within hours. But making that call would require explanations she wasn't prepared to give, and the revelation might destroy their relationship at the moment when David needed her support most. "Let me help," Margaret said carefully. "I have some money saved." David looked at her with surprise. "Margaret, you're living in a shelter. I can't take your money." "I have more than you think," Margaret said, struggling with how much truth to reveal. "Please, let me do this for you." David's pride warred with his desperation to see his father. Margaret could see the internal conflict playing out across his face. Finally, his love for his family won. "I'll pay you back," he said firmly. "Every penny, I promise." Margaret nodded, though she knew she would never want or need repayment. She excused herself to make a phone call, telling David she needed to contact someone who owed her money. In reality, she called her lawyer and arranged for an immediate cash advance against her trust fund. Within 2 hours, Margaret had secured enough money for David's plane ticket and emergency expenses. She presented it to him as carefully saved funds, but she could see questions forming in his eyes about how someone living in a homeless shelter could produce such a substantial amount so quickly. "Thank you," David said, holding her close. "I don't understand how you managed this, but I'll never forget what you've done for me." As David packed hastily for his trip, Margaret wrestled with the decision of whether to accompany him. She desperately wanted to support him during this family crisis, but meeting his family would require more elaborate deceptions about her background and current situation. "Come with me," David said suddenly, as if reading her thoughts. "I need you there, Margaret. You're the most important person in my world now, and I want you to meet my family." Margaret's heart soared and plummeted simultaneously. She wanted nothing more than to be by David's side during this difficult time. But the complications seemed overwhelming. "Are you sure?" she asked. "This is a family emergency. I don't want to be an intrusion." "You're not an intrusion," David said, taking her hands in his. "You're part of my life now. Please come with me." The flight to David's hometown gave Margaret time to prepare for the challenges ahead. She would need to maintain her deception while meeting David's family during one of the most stressful periods of their lives. She also worried about how David's working-class family would react to what they would perceive as their son's homeless girlfriend. David's mother, Linda, met them at the hospital with red eyes and exhausted worry etched across her face. Despite her own emotional state, she welcomed Margaret with warmth and gratitude. "Thank you for being there for my son," Linda said, embracing Margaret. "He told me how you helped him get home. You must be very special to him." Margaret spent the next several days in the hospital waiting room, watching David's family rally around their patriarch. She observed the genuine love and support they showed each other, despite their financial limitations. When medical bills became a concern, family members quietly pooled resources without fanfare or resentment. David's younger sister, Sarah, worked as a nurse and used her medical knowledge to help the family understand the doctor's explanations. His brother Mike took time off from his construction job to drive their mother back and forth to the hospital. The family's unity and mutual support reminded Margaret of what she had lost when her own parents died. Dad always said that family isn't about what you have, but about how you take care of each other, David told Margaret during one of their quiet moments in the hospital corridor. "I see that more clearly now than ever." Margaret felt overwhelmed by the love and acceptance she experienced from David's family. They treated her as one of their own, sharing meals, including her in family discussions, and expressing genuine concern for her well-being. She had never experienced such unconditional acceptance, and the guilt about her deception grew heavier with each passing day. The crisis deepened when doctors informed the family that David's father would need expensive cardiac surgery that wasn't fully covered by his insurance. The family faced the devastating choice between potentially life-saving treatment and financial ruin. Margaret listened to hushed conversations about second mortgages, loan applications, and family members volunteering to take on debt they couldn't afford. She knew she could resolve the entire situation with a fraction of her hidden wealth, but revealing her resources would require explanations that could destroy everything. That night, in the small motel room she shared with David near the hospital, Margaret made a decision that would change everything. She couldn't watch the man she loved and his family suffer when she had the power to help. The time had come to risk everything by telling the truth. "David," she said softly as they lay in the darkness, "there's something I need to tell you. Something I should have told you months ago." David turned toward her, and even in the dim light, she could see the concern in his eyes. "What is it?" Margaret took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether their love was strong enough to survive the truth about who she really was. Margaret's hands trembled as she prepared to reveal the truth that could either save or destroy the most important relationship of her life. In the quiet darkness of their motel room, with David's father fighting for his life down the hall, she knew she couldn't maintain her deception any longer. "David, my real name is Margaret Williams," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not who you think I am." David sat up in bed, confusion evident in his silhouette against the dim light from the window. "What do you mean?" Margaret took a shaky breath and began to tell her story. She explained about her father's technology company, the millions of dollars she had inherited, the empty life of luxury she had been living, and her desperate decision to leave it all behind to find authentic love and connection. "I've been living on the streets by choice," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I wanted to discover who would love me for who I really am, not for my money. I wanted to find someone who would see my heart, not my bank account." David was silent for a long moment, and Margaret could feel the weight of his shock and hurt. When he finally spoke, his voice was strained with emotion. "You've been lying to me this entire time?" he asked. "Everything about who you are, where you came from, why you're living the way you are, all of it was false?" "Not everything," Margaret said desperately. My feelings for you are completely real. The person you fell in love with, that's who I really am underneath all the wealth and privilege. I've never been more myself than I have been with you." David stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the hospital parking lot where ambulances occasionally arrived with their urgent cargo. Margaret could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself rigid as he processed her revelation. "So when I was worried about paying rent, when I was skipping meals to buy art supplies, when my father was lying in that hospital bed and we were talking about going into debt for his surgery, you could have solved all of it with a phone call?" David's voice was quiet, but Margaret could hear the pain and anger beneath his controlled tone. "Yes," Margaret admitted, her heart breaking. "And it was torture watching you struggle, knowing I could help but not being able to without destroying what we had." David turned around, and in the dim light, Margaret could see tears in his eyes. "What we had was built on a lie, Margaret. How can I trust anything about our relationship when the fundamental truth about who you are was false?" Margaret felt as though her world was crumbling. She had found the love she had been searching for, only to potentially lose it because of the very deception she had used to find it. "I know I hurt you," she said, standing and taking a tentative step toward him. "I know what I did was wrong. But David, please believe me when I say that falling in love with you was never part of the plan. What happened between us was real, even if the circumstances weren't." David sat heavily on the edge of the bed, putting his head in his hands. "I fell in love with someone I thought was brave enough to choose authenticity over comfort, someone who understood what it meant to struggle, someone who valued the same things I do. But you were just playing a role." "No," Margaret said firmly, kneeling in front of him. "I wasn't playing a role. Everything you learned about my values, my heart, my character, that was real. I did choose authenticity over comfort, David. I gave up everything I had known to find something genuine." She reached for his hands, relieved when he didn't pull away. "The Margaret you fell in love with is who I really am. The wealthy heiress was the role I was playing before I met you, living on the streets, spending time with you, discovering what really matters in life. That's when I finally became myself." David looked into her eyes, and Margaret could see him struggling between hurt and love, between anger and understanding. "But you let me worry about money while you had millions. You watched my family stress about medical bills when you could have helped." "I can help now," Margaret said quickly. "I can pay for your father's surgery, and I want to. Not because I'm trying to buy your forgiveness, but because I love you and your family, and because it's the right thing to do." David pulled his hands away and stood up again. "Don't you see? If you pay for Dad's surgery now, I'll never know if you're doing it out of love or guilt. I'll never know if I'm accepting it because I care about my father or because I'm being bought." Margaret felt desperate as she watched the man she loved wrestle with impossible questions. She realized that her wealth, which she had thought would be a gift she could eventually share with someone she loved, had instead become a barrier that might prevent love from surviving. "What can I do?" she asked. "How can I prove to you that my feelings are real, that the person you fell in love with is who I really am?" David was quiet for several minutes, clearly thinking deeply about her question. Finally, he sat back down and looked at her with an expression that mixed sadness with something that might have been hope. "I need time," he said. "I need to process this, and I need to see how you handle the situation with my father. Not just whether you help, but how you help. Your actions right now, knowing what I know about you, will tell me who you really are." Margaret nodded, understanding that this was likely her only chance to prove that her love was genuine and that her character was real. "I'll do whatever you think is right." The next morning, Margaret called her lawyer and arranged for an anonymous donation to cover David's father's surgery and all related medical expenses. She insisted that the family never know the source of the gift, presenting it instead as a charitable fund for families facing medical emergencies. When the hospital financial counselor informed David's family about the mysterious donation, Margaret watched David carefully for his reaction. She saw surprise, relief, and gratitude, but also a searching look in her direction. Later that day, David's father's surgery was successful. As the family celebrated in the waiting room, Margaret felt a complex mixture of joy for their relief and anxiety about her own future with David. That evening, David asked Margaret to walk with him in the hospital's garden. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, and Margaret couldn't help but remember all the beautiful sunsets they had watched together from the library steps. "I know you arranged for that donation," David said quietly. "The timing was too convenient to be coincidental," Margaret nodded, not attempting to deny it. "I couldn't watch your family suffer when I had the power to help, but I tried to do it in a way that preserved everyone's dignity." David stopped walking and turned to face her. "That tells me something important about who you are. You could have swept in as the wealthy savior, making sure everyone knew you were the hero. Instead, you helped quietly and let my family keep their pride." Margaret felt a small spark of hope. "Does that mean something to you?" "It means everything," David said, his voice softening. "It shows me that the woman I fell in love with, the one who values authenticity and treats people with respect regardless of their circumstances, that person is real." They sat on a bench surrounded by flowering bushes, and David took Margaret's hand for the first time since she had revealed the truth. "I'm still hurt about the deception," he said honestly. "It's going to take time for me to fully trust again. But Margaret, I understand why you did it, and I can see that your heart was in the right place." Margaret felt tears of relief and hope streaming down her face. "I love you, David. I love you more than I ever thought possible. And I want to build a real life with you, an honest life with no more secrets." David squeezed her hand. "I love you too. The you that I've gotten to know. The real you. We'll have to figure out how to navigate the differences in our backgrounds, but if you're willing to be completely honest from now on, I'm willing to try." Margaret nodded eagerly. "Complete honesty, I promise. And David, my money doesn't have to change anything between us. We can live however you want to live. I learned more about what matters in life during these past months with you than I learned in 32 years of wealth." David smiled for the first time since she had revealed her secret. "Maybe we can find a balance. I don't want your money to define our relationship, but I also don't want to pretend it doesn't exist. What matters most is that we build something real together." As they sat in the peaceful garden with David's father recovering safely inside the hospital, Margaret realized that her journey had led her exactly where she needed to be. She had hidden her fortune and lived on the streets, and in doing so, she had discovered a love more valuable than any amount of money. A love based on genuine connection, shared values, and authentic affection. The result touched her heart more deeply than she had ever imagined possible. She had found not just romantic love, but a new understanding of what it meant to live a meaningful life. Most importantly, she had discovered that true love could survive even the most difficult truths when it was built on a foundation of genuine character and mutual respect. Margaret and David's love story was just beginning, but it was now based on complete honesty and the knowledge that they had chosen each other not for what they possessed, but for who they truly were in their hearts.